But this month, it's a fascinating talk. The 30s were a time of very much change in Hampstead and Belsize, and it's interesting at seeing what arose out of it. So can I pass you now over to Averil, who will take us on this journey of some of the artists, refugees, and spies who appeared in Belsize at this time. Averil.
Thank you very much, Martin. Yes, I will be talking about how art and espionage flourished in Belsize in the 1930s as fascism spread across Europe. And in the process, we'll meet some amazing people whose combined talents had an extraordinary influence in the UK and beyond. I've said that this talk is about Belsize, but actually it's about a much smaller area. We're really focusing on 2 roads and 2 buildings, and you'll see from the slides the ones I'm talking about. So we're going to start by meeting British artists who lived in Park Hill Road and the Mull Studios that are just off Park Hill Road, and the refugees who joined them. And then I'm going to introduce you to the Lawn Road Flats, which are now better known as Isakon, and more refugees and spies who live there and also at other places in Lawn Road. If these roads don't mean much to you, we're on the eastern side of Haverstock Hill, south of Belsize Park Station, and Park Hill Road is approximately opposite England's Lane, if that means any more to you. But I'm going to start with the artists. So after the First World War, British artists were pretty isolated. They tended to paint representational and romantic works, and they weren't very much connected with Paris, where all the different artistic movements were focused. So I'm going to start talking about Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, whose careers really sort of ran in parallel. And they both came from Yorkshire. Henry Moore was born into a miner's family in a small mining town called Castleford in Yorkshire. But having fought in the First World War, in 1919, he had the opportunity of getting an ex-serviceman's grant and went to the Leeds School of Art, where he completed the 2-year drawing course in 1 year and then went on to study sculpture in a new department that had just been set up. In the second year there, Barbara Hepworth also arrived to study sculpture. She'd grown up in Wakefield. Her father was a civil engineer. And at the time, the Vice-Chancellor in Leeds was Michael Sadler, who was one of the first collectors of modernist art. And it's believed that both Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth would have seen his art collection and be influenced by it. In 1921, they both moved to study sculpture at the Royal College of Art with other students from Leeds. And at the time, the Royal College was pretty conservative. So when they could save enough money, they would travel to Paris to see what was going on in the international art world. And both sculptures were influenced by Brancusi, whose work they saw there, and they adopted his approach, which was to respond to the qualities of the material they were carving, rather than working to preconceived ideas. Henry Moore was also very influenced by his visits to the British Museum, where he saw African and Aztec sculpture. When he graduated in 1924, Henry Moore had also got a teaching qualification. So he got a job to teach 2 days a week at the Royal College, which meant that he was subsequently rather better off than his contemporaries. When Barbara Hepworth graduated, she got a scholarship to study in Italy, where she learned to carve marble. And she was on the scholarship with a fellow sculptor, Jack Skeeping, and they married in 1925. And in 1928, went to live at 7 The Mull Studios. Now, the Mull Studios, which are just off Park Hill Road, they're between Park Hill Road and St Dominic's Priory, were built in 1872 to be the studios of gentlemen artists who had houses in Park Hill Road. They have 20-foot north-facing windows and skylights, so the artists have consistent light. But by the time Barbara and Jack moved in, artists were less well off, and so they lived and worked there. In July 1929, Henry Moore married Irina, and Barbara and Jack found them a studio and flat at 11A Park Hill Road, just along the road from where their studio was, and that was their London base until 1940. In the evenings, the couples would get together in one or other studio and sketch, maybe with a life model, drink and play shove halfpenny, which Henry Moore was apparently particularly good at. In August 1929, Barbara and Jack had a baby, Paul. In April 1931, Barbara exhibited at the Bloomsbury Gallery with the artist Ben Nicholson, and she introduced Ben and his wife Winifred, who was also a painter, to the Moores. In September 1931, Barbara, the Moores, and other friends went on holiday to Norfolk, and Barbara invited Ben to join them. And the group talked and walked and swam and played cricket and worked and danced. And by the second week, when Barbara's husband Jack arrived, Barbara and Ben had already fallen in love. And so at the end of the second week, Ben returned to Cumbria to tell his wife that he was leaving her and their 3 children for Barbara, and Barbara returned to Jack and asked for a divorce. And very soon after, Ben moved to a room in Park Hill Road, just round the corner from the Mull Studios. Ben didn't really anticipate major difficulties in leaving his wife and moving in with Barbara. He believed if he was true to his feelings, everybody would adjust. And he moved frequently between Barbara and Winifred and his children. Both Barbara and Winifred were Christian Scientists, and as part of their religion, they felt they shouldn't hold ill feelings to people they loved. But inevitably, they struggled with the situation, and over time, Barbara lost her faith. In 1932, Barbara Hepworth pierced a hole in a stone and created this pierced form in the middle of the side, and she felt that it was tremendously liberating. Later that same year, Henry Moore created the composition on the right in Hornton stone that also had a hole in it. And holes, or interior spaces, as they might have described them, were a motif that was a distinctive part of both their work after that. Because Henry Moore's work had become increasingly abstract, he'd moved away from the other teachers at the Royal College, and so he resigned. But shortly afterwards, he was asked to set up a sculpture department at Chelsea. By the end of 1932, Winifred Nicholson had moved to Paris with the children, so Ben used to travel there regularly. And when he was there, he established contacts with leading artists in Paris, including Picasso and Brancusi, Miro, Arp, Gabot, and Calder. And Barbara, who also wanted to have the same new artistic experiences, used to join him there. So Ben became, over time, the informal link between Paris and London artists. And he was also very influenced by the work he saw in Paris and started creating white abstract reliefs. I'm afraid, though, he created a lot of them. They're all sort of have copyright that makes it difficult to share them with you, so I apologize for that. In 1934, Barbara became pregnant. And because the condition in the studio, which you see on the left, was very cramped, they rented a basement flat around the corner at 3 Church Road, as it was called at the time. And in October, Barbara gave birth to triplets. There had been no forewarning, but she said, "It was a tremendously exciting event. We were only prepared for one child, and the arrival of 3 babies by 6 o'clock in the morning meant considerable improvisation for the first few days." When the babies were 2 months old, Ben went off to Paris to see his other children, and Barbara struggled to look after 3 babies in a flat she described as damp and cramped, with leaking gas, a leaking boiler, and windows falling in. So in desperation, she arranged for the triplets to be cared for in a nursery training college in Golders Green from when they were 4 months to a year. When Barbara returned to work in 1935, her sculpture changed, and it had reduced to much simpler shapes and eradicated almost all colour. And she said she was absorbed in the relationships in space, in size and texture and weight, as well as the tensions between forms. So it was interesting that her first sculpture after the triplets was born was the 3 forms, and then you can see the triplets when they were a little bit older. By then, someone else had joined them in the Mull Studios. Herbert Reed was very significant as part of this story, but he wasn't an artist. He was a poet, writer, and art critic who'd won the highest awards for bravery in the First World War, and he felt he'd been saved for a purpose, and that purpose was modern art. When he first saw Moore and Hepworth's work in 1931, he was extremely impressed, and he liked the way they were both true to the materials. And he had an ability to write and speak articulately, which made him a very powerful advocate for the artist's work. He also came from Yorkshire and had been a student at Leeds, so they had a lot in common. In summer 1933, when he was 39, Herbert Reed left his wife and his post as a professor of fine art in Edinburgh to join a 28-year-old viola player, Margaret Ludwig, who was also known as Ludo. And they temporarily stayed in the Moores flats before moving into 3 Mull Studios. Herbert Reed was a man of contradictions. He had medals for heroism, but he became a very convinced pacifist. He was an anarchist who was an extremely good organizer and accepted a knighthood later in life and became one of the great and good of the artistic world. And he was very quiet and softly spoken, but he loved giving parties. And he was described as the social glue of the British Modernist Movement. He would regularly invite the artists we've already met around, but others, including the architect Wells Coates and the artist Paul Nash, who I will introduce you to in a minute. Barbara Hepworth said they were very blessed by his presence because he coordinated the group, but also supported and valued each artist individually. And Henry Moore said that he was the champion of the whole of contemporary art in England. Wells Coates was a Canadian architect, designer and writer who had embraced the architecture of Corbusier and saw buildings as machines for living. He designed the Lawn Road flats, which you probably would know of as Isakon, and I will talk more about them in a minute. He was also a modernist designer, and the Bakelite radio is an example of how he applied modern design to modern technology. Paul Nash was a landscape artist who by the 1930s had started to add incongruous elements influenced by surrealist ideas into his landscape. And in 1934, Paul Nash brought together a collective of 11 artists and architects for the Unit 1 exhibition. And they included Henry Moore, Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson, and Wells Coates. And Herbert Reed wrote the catalogue. This wasn't intended as a one-off exhibition. It was intended to be a movement. And it was very much influenced by the Bauhaus in Germany, which brought together arts and crafts to build bridges between artists and mass production to make beauty and quality available in every home. Coincidentally, in 1934, the architect Walter Gropius, who was the founder and spiritual father of the Bauhaus, arrived in the Lawn Road flats, fleeing Nazism. He feared for his life after the Nazis came into power and closed down the Bauhaus school. And he was offered accommodation in the Lawn Road flats, but he was also very warmly welcomed by Herbert Reed, who had had an ambition to set up a Bauhaus in Britain. And Reed and Gropius were very much kindred spirits. They both believed art should be at the heart of education, accessible to all, and that it had the power to redeem mankind. Three other influential members of the Bauhaus followed Gropius to the Lawn Road flats. So they were Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was a relentless experimenter and in addition to painting and photography, used a wide range of media to explore how basic elements interact. Another Hungarian was Marcel Breuer, who was an innovative furniture designer and architect. And he was influenced by steel tubes, as in bicycle handlebars, to design the Wassily chair, and by bending plywood to design the Isaacan chair. And the third member of the Bauhaus staff was the Russian sculptor Naum Gabo, who explored time, space, and matter and was influenced by new scientific developments. And because their thinking was so allied, they all mixed very readily with the British artists who we've already met. In 1936, there was a very big artistic event in London, and it was the International Surrealist Exhibition. It was initiated by Roland Penrose, who had lived in Paris and recently returned to Hampstead. And it included 390 works by artists including Picasso, Klee, Duchamp, Man Ray, Dali, Magritte, Miro, Breton, and Brancusi. And the work of many of these artists hadn't been seen in London before. And it was seen very much as a watershed, and it was said that London was never so provincial after this. But the Surrealist exhibition split the Belsize artists. Henry Moore, Paul Nash, and Herbert Reed were all on the English selection committee, and they saw Surrealism as totally compatible with abstract modernism. But Ben and Barbara Hepworth disagreed. They thought Surrealism represented a revolution of consciousness, and that was very different from the freedom of imagination in modernism. So in response to the Surrealist exhibition, Ben Nicholson, Naum Gabo, and an architect called Leslie Martin created a manifesto of modern architecture and non-figurative art. So the Circle's publication linked art and science and was an intellectual response to modern culture, drawing on the Bauhaus thinking. And the people who contributed to Circles were both English and continental artists. And for the first time, it made London seem a place that might be open to continental artists if they needed to migrate. Herbert Reed believed that Unit 1 and Circle's publication set the agenda for art in the United Kingdom for the next 25 years. In 1937, there were two art exhibitions in Munich. There was the Great German Art Exhibition, which was the artists that the Nazis approved, and the Degenerate Artists Exhibition, which was the proscribed modern artists. And amongst the artists included in the Degenerate Artists was the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian. Mondrian had lived in Paris for 27 years by then, but he became very frightened that the Nazis might invade France and that he would be at great risk if they did. So aged 66, he fled to London, and it was Wilfred Nicholson, Ben's first wife, who brought him to London, and Ben Nicholson, who found him lodgings in 60 Park Hill Road, just round the corner from the Mull Studios. And his lodgings were in the back of the ground floor of the house you can see in the image. The younger artists were delighted that such an eminent artist should join them, and did everything that they could to make him comfortable. Mondrian had the brown walls of his studio painted white and added blocks of primary colours to make his studio like a living 3D paintings. There was a gate at the bottom of the garden that led directly to the multi-studios, and sometimes he would have tea with Barbara and Ben and the triplets. Barbara thought his studio was very, very beautiful, but he liked the domesticity of hers, with the jumble of children, rocks, sculpture, trees, flowers, and washing. Mondrian thought that the wide streets at Belsize Park and the tourist sites in central London he preferred them to Paris, which he saw as a toy city by comparison. And he liked the greater space and freedom, and that was reflected in the increasing white areas in his work. He loved jazz and dancing, and he liked the company of women, and the wives of younger artists would go with him to jazz clubs and dance with him, although it seemed to be a better experience for him than it was for them. So they took turns in partnering him. But he would choose to discuss art with men rather than women. Barbara Hepworth said that the arrival of the continental artists made England feel suddenly alive and rich. And for a few years, London was seen as an international art centre of modernism. But as the threat of war increased, the artists began to disperse, with the British artists moving out of London and refugees to the States. And after the war, it was New York that became the international centre of modernist art. Reed described the 5 years that he lived in the Mull Studios, which he described as a nest of gentle artists, as the best years of his life. And he said, such a feeling of unanimity was never to exist again after the war. But English art had come of age. Within the next decade, it was to become what it had not been for more than a century, an art of international significance. So we're going to leave the artists here and move on to the Lawn Road flats, which at that time were known as the Lawn Road flats. And I believe it was only when they were managed by Camden in the 1970s, who had other flats in Lawn Road, that they became known as Isaacon. They were experimental modernist flats which were opened in 1934. They were designed by the Canadian Wells Coates, who we've already met. They're grade 1 listed, and they were described as the first modernist and the first reinforced concrete flats in Britain. They were commissioned by Jack and Molly Pritchard, and Jack was very well travelled, and he was influenced by Bauhaus architecture, but also by communal living arrangements in Vienna. And they combined the sleek modernist architecture of the block with experimental minimalist urban living. The 32 compact apartments were seen as ready to live in flats because all the furniture was built in, and they had very full domestic service. I don't know if you can read on the advertisement, but it says shoe cleaning, window cleaning, everything done for you, meals in your flat or in the club. They were intended for young professional people who wouldn't already have many possessions, but that meant they were also very suitable for refugees. And in 1937, the isobar and restaurant were added, which became a hub for Hampstead intellectual life and perhaps picked up where the Reeds had left off when they moved out of the studios. Jack and Molly Pritchard were the quintessential modern Hampstead couple. They shared many progressive ideas, including having an open marriage. Molly had a relationship with Wells Coates, which Jack actually found to be very convenient because at different times there were tensions between Jack and Wells when he was designing the flats, and Molly could smooth over the tensions. Jack also had a relationship and a daughter with a woman called Beatrice Tudor Hart, who was a progressive teacher. And Beatrice and Molly set up a nursery together, which all three children went to. When Jack wanted to commission a photographer to take pictures of the flat's development, Beatrice introduced him to her sister-in-law, Edith, who was a photographer, who we'll hear a little more about later. Jack was described as a man who could make things happen despite the odds. He was stridently opposed to appeasement and helped many refugees escape from Europe. At the time, the British government wasn't prepared to become directly involved in supporting German-speaking refugees, so they were dependent on individuals or voluntary organisations assisting them. And Jack sponsored many refugees, both by providing temporary accommodation in the flats, but also helping people get work permits by either offering them jobs in his furniture company or persuading his friends and relatives that they needed domestic staff. We've already met Walter Gropius, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Marcel Brewer, and Naum Gabo, but there were many others. If you're interested in finding out more about the architecture and the concept of the flats and the number of amazing people who lived there, how the flats were restored, then I would thoroughly recommend that you go to the Isaac Gallery, which is in what were the garages of the flats. It's open every Saturday and Sunday, but just till the end of October, and then from March. But this year, there has also been an additional exhibition there, which is about 150 years of the Mull Studios and all the artists who've lived and worked there. So I've just sort of touched on those issues, but you can find out a great deal more at the gallery. But we're going to move swiftly on to the spies, and to set the background to that, I'll say a little bit more about the impact of fascism in Germany and Austria. In 1933, the Nazis set about cleansing German cultural life of socialists, Bolsheviks, what they saw as Bolshevik artists, as well as Jews. And in the same year, the Communist Party was banned in Austria. The first refugees to escape fascism generally came for cultural and political reasons, regardless of their religion. Although in the end, they only made about 8 to 10% of the German-speaking refugees who arrived in the UK. And many of these early refugees had already been active members of the Communist Party and involved with international communist organizations. And they saw the Soviet Union as the savior who would rid their homelands of fascism so they could return from exile to their countries of origin. So they were strongly motivated to assist the Soviet Union in continued political activities. Because the Communist Party of Great Britain was small and didn't have the same sort of international connections, when Soviet intelligence groups wanted to set up spy networks in Britain, they recruited German and Austrian refugees to help set up the networks. Austrian and German Marxists had very different traditions and reported to competing Soviet intelligence agencies. So we will follow the espionage links to the Austrian communists first and then the German communists. Because the spy networks were so separate, the spies could be neighbours and they probably wouldn't have known of each other's activities. So, starting with Edith Tudor Hart, who was the sister-in-law of Beatrice Tudor Hart and was introduced to the Pritchards to photograph the flats. She was an Austrian photographer who had a studio in the basement of 158 Haverstock Hill. She was born in Vienna and joined the Communist Party when she was 15. And she trained as a photographer in the Bauhaus and saw the camera as a political weapon to build awareness of the shocking living conditions, unemployment, disease, and hunger of the working classes in the 1930s. She was recruited to the Soviet spy network in Vienna by Arnold Deutsch. And having married an Englishman, Alexander Tudor Hart, she moved to London in 1933. Arnold Deutsch moved to London in 1934, specifically to establish a spy network. In 1936, when he was looking for accommodation for himself and his wife, Edith introduced him to the Pritchards, and so he moved into a flat in the Lawn Road flats. And he was, the approach he took to recruiting spies was to cultivate Oxbridge students who were communist sympathisers and who in time would reach the upper echelons of the British establishment. He was one of the most successful Soviet spy masters in London, and he recruited at least 20 agents. They included the Cambridge Five of Kim Philby, Donald McCain, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. And it was Edith who introduced him to Kim Philby, who she'd met in Vienna. At the height of his clandestine career, Philby was the head of Soviet intelligence for MI6 and was also the first secretary to the British Embassy in New York. Edith also helped him recruit Anthony Blunt and Arthur Wynne, who was an Oxford spy ringmaster aiming to develop a spy ring similar to the one in Cambridge. Though MI5 kept an active watch on Edith, they never caught her spying and probably underestimated her impact as a wife and mother. Down the road to Arnold Deutsch at number 9 Lawn Road, Theodore Mali, who was an experienced Hungarian communist, arrived in 1936, and he was sent to London to take control of some foreign office spies, to assist Deutsch with Cambridge spy ring, and to set up a spy ring in Woolwich Arsenal. Before he moved to 9 Lawn Road, an Irish courier, Brian Gould-Fairchiles, also had lived there. He also did live there. MI5 described Brian as highly strung and nervous, and one of the least suitable people to be in the world of spies. Mali became his minder. Brian Gould-Fairchiles had already fallen foul of the Soviet intelligence agencies by travelling to Moscow twice without permission. And in 1936, he was recalled to Moscow to train as a radio operator. When his girlfriend joined him there, he again was very much out of favour. So he was sent to Spain to fight fascism. By then, he'd become very disillusioned and asked to leave the spy network. But he was charged with counter-revolutionary activities and sentenced to 8 years in a gulag, where he died in 1942. His activities didn't reflect well on Mali. And in 1937, other difficulties followed. Philby had established such an effective cover as a pro-German Nazi sympathizer that another Soviet intelligence agency raised suspicions that he actually was a German spy. Also, Edith Tudor Hart had lost a dowry that Deutsch had given her for safekeeping. And when the Moscow Centre heard about the dowry being lost, they shut down Deutsch's network and sidelined him. 3 weeks later, Edith found the dowry behind a cushion down the back of a sofa, but it was too late. And after a series of other mishaps with the Woolwich network, Mali was recalled to Moscow and executed as a German spy in 1938. This was the time of Stalin's great purges, and 1.5 million people were arrested and nearly 700,000 killed between 1936 and 1938. Spies, particularly those who were non-Russian and had contact with foreigners, were seen as very suspect. So at that point, I'm going to leave the Asian spies and just talk a bit about, the Austrian spies, and just talk a bit about the German spies. The Kuczynski family were amongst the first wave of German refugees. They were wealthy and very well connected. Robert Kuczynski was one of Germany's most distinguished statisticians and demographers. But in 1933, as a Jewish left-wing academic, he fled Germany for his life. He came to London for a short course at LSE and never returned, and later got a permanent job at LSE. And a refugee agency found him a 3-roomed flat at 12 Lawn Road, where his wife and 4 of his 5 daughters joined him. The Kaczynski family apparently fitted so easily into Hampstead life that it was said that at one stage you couldn't go to a dinner party in Hampstead without meeting one of them. Bridget Kaczynski, who is the second daughter, married Anthony Gordon Lewis and moved to the Lawn Road flats where he lived in 1936. The eldest of the family, Jürgen, was in his late 20s when the others escaped from Germany in 1933. But he went underground to be part of the anti-fascist resistance. In 1936, he was instructed to come to London to coordinate the German Communist Party members here. He also had an international academic reputation, so had easy access to the British establishment and was able to provide regular information to the Soviet agencies. His sister Sonia, the eldest of the daughters, was already a well-established Soviet agent. Ursula had already worked in China and then subsequently worked in Poland and Switzerland, and she was codenamed Sonia. And some of you may have read Ben McIntyre's book about her career called Agent Sonia. By 1938, Ursula was recruiting agents for a clandestine mission in Germany. And she got her sister Bridget, who was living in the Lawn Road flats, to brief the agents before they went out on their mission. One of the agents who was briefed by Bridget in 1938 said, "Nothing could have been more incongruous than the contrast between this epitome of bourgeois smugness and the work that was transacted in its midst." In 1939, the agents working in Germany came up with a feasible plan to assassinate Hitler in a Munich restaurant. The plan was scrapped when the German-Soviet non-aggression pact was signed. That was a very real test of loyalty of the spies, as the Soviet Union, that they had seen as their savior, had joined the enemy. Early in the war, Jürgen was recruited as a CIA statistician and still continued to work as a Soviet spy. In 1941, Klaus Fuchs, a German communist physicist who was part of the British atomic bomb program, approached Jürgen, offering to share information with Soviet intelligence. He was assigned an intelligence officer, but when arrangements broke down, Jürgen organized that his sister, Ursula, who by then was in Britain, should become his handler. Fuchs never saw himself as a spy. He considered that after the Soviet Union joined the war in 1941, that he couldn't understand why the West wasn't prepared to share information with its ally about the atomic bomb. He thought the immense destructive potential of the bomb should be shared between the big powers equally. Fuchs, who worked both in the UK and in America, continued to share secrets about his work until 1950, when he was arrested and imprisoned. And there are various views about how significant the information he shared was on the Soviet atomic bomb program, and whether or not they would have been able to develop it without his information. When he was released in 1952, he returned to East Germany to continue his career as a nuclear scientist. Ursula escaped to East Germany shortly before Fuchs's trial in 1950, and she became a well-known writer under the pseudonym of Ruth Werner, and also wrote her autobiography. Jürgen returned from exile to East Germany in 1945 and continues his academic career as a senior member of the country's revolutionary aristocracy. He never lost his Marxist faith or his support for the East German regime. But just to round off, I will come back to Edith Tudor Hart, who was both an artist, a refugee, and a spy. Edith earned a modest living as a photographer. She was never paid for work as a secret agent, and she struggled to get support for her son, who would now be described as severely autistic, and in the end reluctantly had to place him in an institution. The pressures of caring for her son and the strain of her double life took a toll on her health, and in the early 1950s she had a complete breakdown and spent several months in a sanatorium. After that, she opened an antique shop in Brighton, and she remained a staunch communist member until her death in 1973. And it wasn't till 20 years later, in 1993, that her family found out about her secret life as a spy. And it was 20 more years until 2013, when the importance of her photography was celebrated in exhibitions in Edinburgh and Vienna, called In the Shadow of Tyranny. And in 2019, her work was exhibited in the Tate. Last year, Charlotte Philby wrote a fictionalized story about Edith and her grandfather, Kim, recreating the strange underground life of a forgotten artist and spy. And that is where I end my talk.
Wow. Thank you very much. I mean, what an amazing story of network of both artists and spies. I, in the 1960s, lived in 158 Haverstock Hill, and I'm amazed to realize now that it was where previously the spy Edith Tudor Hart lived. It's amazing. Now, if anyone would like to ask questions, please take the opportunity now and unmute yourself to do so. Can't see anyone yet. Is anyone wanting to ask questions on this? I'm surprised. I think you've covered so much so well. I think you've amazed and bewildered us with so much extra information, a lot of which I'd never heard. Now, there is one. Just trying to see,
There's Ellen Ramsey wanting to ask.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't see that. Please, Ellen, do speak.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Averil. That was a wonderful talk, amazing. And I'm impressed with the research that you've done. And I was wondering if you could please give us some of the highlights of your research and your archival sources.
I have to say, this is a bit of a cheat, because in the last 8 or 10 years, a lot of people have done very detailed research. And I've really pulled together information from a lot of sources to give much more of an overview. Other people have gone into a lot of information and told us about many, many more artists, many, many more spies. And so what I was really doing was sort of giving more of an overarching picture. So I do have some books here, thinking that that question might be asked. One of the things which I actually find interesting, which is a much earlier one, is a book which was originally written in 1986 called Belsize, a Living Suburb. And at that time, they were able to interview some of the people who had actually lived in the Mall studios, like Margaret Reed, Herbert Reed's wife, and people who'd been involved in Isacon. So there's some interesting things in that, including, I think, an article that was originally in the Camden History Society review. But other things like the Lawn Road Flats, Spies, Writers and Artists, A Matter of Intelligence, MI5 and the Surveillance of Anti-Nazi Refugees, which I think is probably mainly from National Archive information. That's by Charmian Brinson and Richard Dove. A more recent book, Circles and Squares, by Caroline McLean, and Ben McIntyre, Agent Sonia, Charlotte Philby, Edith and Kim, a book which I don't actually have, but another book was written on the Krajinski family. So I think it's really been something that in all sorts of different ways, lots of people have got interested in over about the last 10 years and found that the information was much more readily available.
Well, thank you. Are there other people that want to ask questions? If not, thank you very much for an amazing account of it, and intriguing of what's happened. You almost take it for granted that there's a building and there's people living it. You just don't know the personalities and what happened around them. So thank you very much indeed for your excellent talk. Thank you.